So now, having completed step 6, here's what I can trust you to do. I can give you any argument on any topic of any length. You can draw a representation of that argument's structure, a diagram of it. You can tell me whether you think the premises of that argument are acceptable, and then you can tell me whether the premises of that argument are relevant. Which brings us to our third and final criterion that we use for evaluating whether an argument should be persuasive or not. And that's sufficiency of grounds. Sufficiency is a really basic kind of question that you ask of all the premises on a certain sub-argument level together. It's the question that asks, is there enough evidence? Even if all the premises are acceptable, even if they all matter. Together, do they constitute a large enough quantity of evidence in order to establish the truth or validity of the conclusion? Note here, too, how important it is to be accurate about the scope of the conclusion. If I'm trying to argue that no governmental regulation is ever acceptable, I need a lot of evidence for that. If I'm trying to argue that this particular example of governmental regulation is excessive, then I need significantly different kinds of evidence for that. So again, having an accurate idea of the conclusion and the structure of the argument is going to be important. Now, just like with relevance, the accuracy of the diagram is going to come into play here. Although, to a certain degree, it's not as important as it was with relevance to distinguish between independent and dependent premises. So say you've got a diagram of an argument that looks like this, a couple different levels of sub-arguments, and you want to evaluate the premises on the basis of sufficiency. Now remember the question, are the premises together enough? Do they constitute enough evidence to establish the conclusion? So what you have to look for in this case are levels of sub-argument. In this diagram, there are 3 claims that give evidence for number 1. So in this case, you have to ask sufficiency here. Are 2, 3, and 4 enough to establish 1? For number 2, there are 3 premises that give evidence for number 2. So you ask the sufficiency question here. For 3, there are 2 here. For 4, there's only 1. And for 9, there's only 1. So in this diagram, assuming that it's accurate, you would ask the question of sufficiency 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Now, if you had an argument that had no sub-arguments at all, you just had one level, perhaps an array of 10 or 12 independent premises, you would only ask the sufficiency question once. So you have to look at the aggregate of all the evidence that is presented at any level of sub-argumentation. Okay, so what does it mean to ask whether there's enough evidence for any given claim? Well, one of the ways in which premises can fail on sufficiency is by omitting some aspect of the topic that is terribly important. And sufficiency is one of the few, perhaps the only criteria that really demands that you look beyond the argument itself, beyond what is actually stated, to question what is missing. So if the argument has omitted a crucial element of the topic addressed in the conclusion, then the premises may fail on sufficiency. So if I'm arguing against the death penalty, and I might say, look, the death penalty should be abolished once and for all, it's unconstitutional, it is terribly costly, and it flies in the face of every moral code that has been developed in Western civilization. People might say, well, that's very good, those are all acceptable, those are all relevant, but what you haven't taken into account is the victim's need for some sort of justice or vengeance. And some people may say that need for justice/vengeance may be more important than all the things you've talked about. Alternatively, one might argue for the death penalty, produce some premises that say, look, it's backed up by several different religious and moral codes, it's fair, and people get great representation, and so on and so forth. But if they never talk about the cost that's associated with having the death penalty and imposing it, that may be a really crucial element that's at least as important, if not more important, than what is measured. Now be careful when applying this criterion, because it's not the case that any gap in an argument will cause it to fail at sufficiency. The question is what is missing from the argument at least as important or more important than what is present? That's the standard. No argument is going to be able to cover every single imaginable facet of the conclusion. But have they covered the most important ones? Has what has been omitted less importance than what has been covered? That's the question that one has to ask. Another ways in which premises can fail in terms of sufficiency. They can fail to take into account important, likely, and negative consequences of the conclusion. So if I'm trying to convince you, for example, to take out as many student loans as you need to get through the next year, and I might say, look, the college is really important. You want to stay where you are. The college that you're attending right now is a good match for your skills and abilities and interests. Take on the loan so that you can stay there. But I don't address consequences of taking that student loan that are important, likely, and negative. Namely, that you'll never be able to get that loan forgiven, that you'll be paying back that loan for decades, that paying back that loan will significantly eat into your earning power as soon as you do graduate from college. If none of those things are addressed, then that argument may fail sufficiency. So again, sufficiency demands that you look at what the argument isn't saying as much as what the argument is saying. Is the evidence enough? Has the arguer done enough work to make sure that the most crucial topics that are relevant to the conclusion have been addressed? Now, keep in mind that just like with other criteria, different people may have different levels of quantity of evidence that they need to see satisfied. So there's a huge difference between the amount of evidence that's needed in a criminal court and the amount of evidence that's needed in a civil court. This is why O.J. Simpson was found responsible for the deaths of his wife and her then husband, but not criminally held responsible for them, because the levels of standards of evidence are less in the civil court as opposed to the criminal court. So too, if someone were trying to convince you that someone that you cared about had in fact a secret double life that had some nefarious aspects to it, because you had an emotional connection to that person, you may need quite a bit more evidence than someone who doesn't have an emotional connection to them. Just like with all other judgments that this approach to critical thinking asks you to take, you must take into consideration your own location, your own specific background knowledge, and your own specific historical, social, political location. But you must try to be explicit about that in your explanations. Now, just like we did for relevance, start working with sufficiency by only focusing on that. Take the first arguments, diagram them as always, and just ask about sufficiency so you can get a feel for how different it is from relevance and acceptability. Once you get a sense of that, then move on. This is what the quiz will ask you to do. Take any argument, diagram it, evaluate that argument in terms of acceptability, evaluate it on the basis of relevance, and then evaluate it on the basis of sufficiency.